Hello, Internet. Welcome to On My Shelf. I am really excited today. Well, I've been excited for most of these broadcasts because I've gotten to pick some of my favorite books to talk to you about. Today, I'm especially excited because we are going to talk about one of my favorite books from one of my favorite authors. We already talked about my favorite book from my favorite author, which is Soren Kierkegaard. But right below Soren Kierkegaard in my pantheon of authors is a fellow you may have heard of called C.S. Lewis. And he wrote a book that just profoundly impacted me. Well, to be honest, he wrote several books that profoundly impacted me, but one of them far beyond all the rest. And it's actually not one of his most well-known books. Mere Christianity, I liked. It was pretty good. I read the Chronicles of Narnia as a kid, loved those. I really like his science fiction trilogy, the Space Trilogy, although technically I've only read the first two. I haven't read the third one yet. I really should read that next. But the one day I decided I wanted to read more C.S. Lewis, and so I bought this volume, which has several of his books together. There is Mere Christianity, the Screwtape Letters, which we're going to talk about. We haven't talked about, have we? Did we? We should. If we haven't, we will. The Abolition of Man, The Problem of Pain, Miracles of Grief Observed, and then this profound little book that snuck up on me out of nowhere. I was just reading through this, just reading the different books, and I came upon The Great Divorce. And this book was so meaningful to me that, in fact, when I was ordained last year, my brother Christopher, as a gift, this was incredible. I couldn't believe he did this. He went out and he bought me this as a present. This is actually a first edition. This is a first edition C.S. Lewis book, The Great Divorce. So this is what the original looked like. I can't believe he did that. It was an awesome gift. One of the best gifts I have ever gotten. This is right up. This is top notch. Also, there's a King James Bible page back there that David Bruce bought me. That was really cool. But anyway, this isn't about gifts that I've received. This is about profound books that have affected me. The Great Divorce. It's a weird name because it's in response to a poem called The Marriage of Heaven and Hell. And so C.S. Lewis is responding to this poem that tried to merge heaven and hell, and that's why he calls it the Great Divorce, the separating of heaven and hell. And it's not a theological book, it's not a treatise, it's a story. It's a novel, or novelette, it's shorter. And it's a story of a dream that he has, and it's a very, very interesting idea. It's more of a hypothetical kind of thought experiment because he's very clear in the introduction. He's not arguing that this is the way heaven and hell really work, but he's using it as a way for us to think about heaven and hell and about how we end up in one place versus the other. And here's the situation. Basically, he sets up he wakes up in this dream. He's in this dream in what's called the Gray Town, and it's this massive gray, foggy city that seems to go on forever, and people. It's very sparsely populated because no one wants to live near each other because nobody can get along, and basically this is his view of hell, at least for right now, and. So he wakes up in hell, and he walks through the town, and he ends up getting in line for a bus. And this bus is going to take people to heaven. And that's the premise of this story, is that a group of people who have died and gone to hell are given a chance to get on this bus and go up to heaven. And so they get in the bus, and the bus takes off, and it's going up and up and up, and as it and suddenly he sees these cliffs, and they come up over the cliffs, and they're in this big green, beautiful country with mountains in the distance. And the interesting thing is he realizes later on, he looks down and finds out that those cliffs, what actually happened was those cliffs were just a little crack in the dirt, and that hell had been this tiny little speck that they came out of, and they actually got bigger. And when they come out of the bus, suddenly they realize that they're all transparent. They're all these wispy ghost kind of figures. And as they walk around, everything is solid and hard, and they can't actually affect anything. So when they walk on the grass doesn't move for them. It doesn't bend. And so they all have a real hard time moving around. And then all these people are coming down from the hills, and they come down to talk to the ghosts. And these people are huge, and they're golden and fit and strong and naked and glowing. And they are the people that have come down out of heaven. And so what happens is people from hell get on the bus and they go up and to the edge of heaven. And then people that they knew in life come down to talk to them and try and convince these people to go into heaven. And most of the book is C.S. Lewis observing the conversations between people from heaven and people from hell. And they're trying to convince the people from hell to stay. And that's the really interesting thing in this story is it's a very plausible, there are very plausible conversations that these people have, and the people from hell don't want to go to heaven. I wrote down some of the conversations that happen. One of them is, the first one is this man who is a blue collar man and who's very stern, and he's the man from hell. And he just insists he's done good all his life. He wasn't particularly religious, but he's been a good man all his life, and all he wants is his rights. And the man that comes down out of heaven is a murderer who repented. And they have this conversation where the murderer is trying to convince him to go up into heaven, and this man is just insulted that a murderer would be allowed in heaven while he is in hell. And he insists that he says, I don't want special treatment. I just want my rights. And the murderer says, well, you'll get a lot better than that. If we got our rights, we would all be down in the bad place. He says, well, I've never done anybody wrong. I just want what I deserve. And they end up talking about the things that he did wrong. And the fact that this man did mistreat his family, and he didn't do everything right the way he says he did. But he can have what he's entitled to, or he can go to heaven, he can have better than what he's entitled to. But for this man, he gets so caught up on his rights, on what he's entitled to, and the fact that he is better than this murderer who was let in. He gets so focused on that he is unwilling to receive grace. And that strikes me as an incredibly plausible interaction for a person. There are people who are so focused on getting what they deserve that they will not accept grace. And I think that can be me sometimes. I can get very caught up on getting what I deserve. And it's kind of like what we talked about with envy. Was that last week? How envy doesn't care how much it has as long as it has more than other people. That's this man. There's another man who comes, he's a philosopher, and he talks with one of his students. The philosopher is from hell and the student is from heaven, and they're talking, and even while he's standing in the midst of heaven, he refuses to believe in a literal heaven and hell. And he wants to spiritualize and philosophize everything and make everything speculative. And he ends up deciding to go back to hell because that's where he can get his papers published. That one is really interesting, especially if you're an academic or a philosopher or a theologian of any kind. It's a very interesting conversation. There's one man who gets to heaven and all he wants to do is steal an apple, which is funny because he can't carry it. And then you realize that the apple won't even fit in hell because hell is a speck and the apple is much bigger. But he's just so focused on stealing on possessing things that all he wants to do in heaven is steal the apple. There's a woman who won't go up into the mountains because she's so embarrassed by the way she looks. She looks like a ghost, and she doesn't want to go be seen by other people and be vulnerable and let them see right through her. And so she refuses to go to heaven. There is a painter who refuses to go to heaven because there will be not that people don't paint in heaven. There's no reason to paint because the beauty that you're trying to capture in a painting, it just exists all the time and you can just see it. But he wants to be appreciated. He wants to get recognition for his painting, and so he refuses to go. There's a woman who wants to see her son. She was obsessed with taking care of her son, and her son is in heaven, but God didn't send her son to her. He sent someone else because she's so obsessed with her son that she won't look to God, and she refuses to go unless her son comes down to get her. There is one man who does choose to go into heaven, but it's only after he allows an angel. He has this lizard on his shoulder that represents his lust, and the angel has to kill it for him, and there's this intense conversation, and finally he kills it, and the lizard dies, but then it is resurrected as this big horse, and they ride off in the mountains. There's this really cool meaning behind all of that I would encourage you to read. And then another one that affected me because I see this tendency in myself. There's a conversation between a woman from heaven and a man from hell, and this man is actually represented in the form of two ghosts. There's a little ghost, and then who's controlling this big Shakespearean actor ghost, who's very melodramatic. And so whenever she talks to him and tries to convince him to come up to heaven, he pretends to be offended, but the little ghost, which is the real guy, he makes his actor ghost take over and pretend to be offended and be all melodramatic, and gets so caught up in his own melodrama that he loses himself, and he doesn't end up going into heaven. And it's really interesting. I encourage you to read it because those brief summaries don't do any of those stories justice. But it's really interesting because the profundity of this story comes in this. I think it's summarized in this particular quote. At one point, the narrator meets the heavenly ghost of his favorite author, George MacDonald, and so that man is his guide as he goes around all these interactions. And this is what he says: "There are only two kinds of people in the end: those who say to God, 'Thy will be done,' and those to whom God says, 'Thy will be done.' All that are in hell choose it. Without that self-choice, there could be no hell. No soul that seriously and constantly desires joy will ever miss it. Those who seek find. To those who knock, it is opened." It's a very interesting idea, and basically what C.S. Lewis proposes is this: that it is possible when we are in rebellion against God, that we will look God in the face and we will see everything he has to offer. We would be able to stand on the edge of heaven, see everything that God offers us, and still say, "No, I don't want it." A lot of people get caught up on the idea that people are, in the Bible, people end up in hell. And think, well, that's so cruel, because if you just gave them a choice, if they just knew that God was real, and if they just saw everything for what it was, then of course everybody would choose heaven. And I think if that were the case, then God would be rather cruel. But my experience with humanity fits more along the lines of what C.S. Lewis is talking about here. It seems that when we get caught up in our rebellion, we will look at everything that God stands for and everything God offers, and we would still look at that and say, "I don't want that. I want things on my terms. I want things my way." I firmly believe that it is possible that people will choose hell, that they would look at God and see him for what he is and reject it. And it all comes down to this choice that we have to make. Are we going to live for God, or are we going to live for ourselves? And there is no pathway to God without us choosing to give up control of ourselves. There is no way that you can marry heaven and hell. This is another thing that he says in the introduction that I think is really important. He says, the attempt to make the marriage of heaven and hell, to make it so everybody goes to the good place and there is no difference between moral and immoral. You know, we're all going to end up with God in the end. That attempt is perennial. People are always making it. It's based on the belief that reality never presents us with an absolutely unavoidable either or. That granted skill and patience, and above all, time enough, some way of embracing both alternatives can always be found. That mere development or adjustment or refinement will somehow turn evil into good without our being called on for a final and total rejection of anything we should like to retain. This belief I take to be a disastrous error. You cannot take all luggage with you on all journeys. On one journey, even your right hand and your right eye must be among the things you have to leave behind. He says, I do not think that all who choose wrong roads perish, but their rescue consists in being put back on the right road. A math equation can be put right, but only by going back until you find the error and working it afresh from that point, never by simply going on. Evil can be undone, but it cannot develop into good. Time does not heal it. The spell must be unwound bit by bit with backward mutters of dissevering power, or else not. It is still either or. If we insist on keeping hell, we shall not see heaven. If we accept heaven, we shall not be able to retain even the smallest and most intimate souvenirs of hell. All of that is to say that what this touches on is this idea that everybody will end up in heaven in the end, and given enough time, we will all, love Jesus. And it's a perspective called universalism. And that's not ultimately the point, I think, of this book, but it's important for us to think about that becoming a Christian means giving God control of our lives and giving up control of ourselves. And there is no way to be a Christian without giving up control of yourself. There is no path to God that does not involve dying to yourself and giving up your independence. And as long as we hold on to our independence, we will not see heaven. We cannot see heaven. And knowing that, I firmly believe that it is in human nature to hang on to that independence to the bitter end and never be willing to relinquish it, no matter what the cost. I think that's something that our culture teaches us is a virtue, that it is better to be independent and miserable than to be dependent and at peace. That it is better to be in control of my own destiny and have that destiny be utter ruin and failure than it is to have someone else control my life, even if that path leads me to eternal life. It's the insight that we find in the poem Paradise Lost that tells the story of Satan, and in Satan's rebellion, about Satan's rebellion to justify it, he says, it is better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven. I think that is something that we humans in our sinful nature would agree with. And so I think that in that instance, we choose hell for ourselves. That if I am in control, if I am in charge, the only result that could happen is hell. Me being in charge is hell. And if I won't relinquish that, God will ultimately give me what I ask for. That has had a profound impact on how I think about heaven and hell, and also how I think about the human condition and what salvation ultimately means. And so I think that's something that all of us need to think about. And I encourage you to read The Great Divorce. It'll give you some things to chew on. I have no idea whether you'll end up feeling the same way about the way heaven and hell works. Again, like I said, that's a thought experiment. He's not necessarily arguing that after we die, we could still choose to go to heaven. That's a whole different ball of wax. It's a thought experiment to get us thinking about how we end up in hell and why we might choose to stay there. So I encourage you to read the book. And next week we're going to be in August, so we're going to be starting the last portion of our Summer of Prayer series. We're going to be focusing on how to serve through prayer, and we're going to be talking about discerning God's will. So if you're local, I'd encourage you to come in and be a part of that service. Either way, I encourage you to be back here on next Monday, and we'll talk about another book. Thanks so much for joining us.